Story 1. Lost Keys. My life isn't filled with thrills, but whenever someone asks for a scary tale, this is the one I share. When I was 15, just before starting my sophomore year, I lived in a typical beach town that bustled with tourists in the summer and turned into a ghost town as soon as the season ended. All the bars and restaurants would shut down, leaving only the locals, the sky, and the ocean behind. If you've never experienced the off-season at the shore, I highly recommend it. It offers one of the strangest yet most soothing feelings in life. Our house sat on a street named Surf Avenue, only a block from the beach, which is ironic because I actually know how to surf. It would have been pretty embarrassing to live on a street called Surf Avenue and not know how to ride a board. I spent my entire childhood there, so the boardwalk and the sand were part of my everyday life, almost a piece of who I am. I don't reside in that exact house anymore, but the property remains in our family, so it still feels like a part of me. Back then, I was on my high school varsity cross-country team, obsessively keeping in shape even in the off-season. Summers at the shore got incredibly hot, so I always ran either very early in the morning or late at night to avoid melting in the heat or becoming that careless runner. That night, I decided to go for a late run, having stayed up with friends the previous evening and overslept the next morning, leaving me no choice. I never took my phone along when I ran. It was always a hassle without music, and even the extra weight bothered me. I used a tiny, beat-up Garmin watch to track my distance and pace, and aside from that, the only item in my pocket was my house key. My parents were extremely strict about keeping the house locked, so as annoying as it was, I always had to shove my keys into my shorts pocket when I went for a run, even if they were at home. It was one of those non-negotiable rules that I still don't understand, especially since most private beach towns are usually very safe. That night, I chose to stick to the boardwalk, whose surface was soft enough on my legs but not as punishing as running on the sand. Sometimes I even jog on the beach for a challenge, but after the day I'd had, I just wanted a long, easy run with minimal changes in terrain, and the boardwalk offered exactly that. After a few miles, I found myself zoning out in a euphoric runner's high. I always tell people that once you pass that 3-mile barrier, the rest becomes nearly enjoyable. I listened to the sound of my shoes slapping on the wood while trying to focus on the distant ocean sounds, completely absorbed in the rhythm of my run. Then, I heard it, a faint clink, and I stopped, checking my pocket to discover it was empty. My heart sank when I realized my keys were gone. I crouched down and peered through the gaps in the boardwalk, but it was pitch black underneath, making it impossible to recover them from where I stood. I began cursing and yelling at the top of my lungs. It might sound silly, but adrenaline from my run had me furious that this detour had ruined my routine. I knew my parents would be livid if I came home without my keys, so without a second thought, I jumped off the side and ran down to the sand. Part of it was about pride. I wasn't going to just leave behind one of my own belongings. The stench beneath the boardwalk hit me immediately, like a mix of rotten seaweed and stale beer. Imagine a bathtub full of seaweed and beer. The damp, heavy smell accompanied every step as I kicked up sand and debris. Since I didn't have my phone, the dim backlight of my watch was my only guide, and it wasn't bright at all. I crouched where I thought my keys had fallen, but all I found were more clumps of sand and bits of trash. It was as disgusting as I remembered, yet I desperately needed those keys. I considered leaving them but decided that after coming this far, I couldn't turn back covered in filth for nothing. I tried shifting the sand around, thinking they might be hidden beneath it, but after several minutes, frustration took over. I must have completely misjudged where they'd fallen. I figured the only rational explanation was that I had been off by a bit. I climbed back up to the boardwalk and paused, trying to pinpoint the exact spot underneath. Then a bright idea struck. I could use my shoelace as a marker. I knelt, untied my shoelace, and slipped it between the planks so it would hang down, allowing me to locate the spot more easily when I crawled back under. As I stood up, something tugged on the lace, and it vanished into the gap. Without any breeze or my own movement, something from below had pulled it away. I was in shock when I realized someone was under the boardwalk. I immediately connected the dots. If someone was down there, they probably had my keys, too. My first impulse was to run home and figure it out later, but the thought of a stranger knowing my home address, which was engraved on those keys, made my blood boil. I couldn't allow someone unknown to have that kind of access. I still don't know why I acted that way, maybe it was foolish teenage confidence, but I took a deep breath, jumped back into the sand, and crawled underneath again. This time, the atmosphere felt different, the air was heavier, and I braced myself for a possible confrontation. At one point, I heard faint shuffling ahead, which made my chest tighten. I shone my watch's light toward the sound but saw nothing but more sand and beams. Continuing onward, I heard shuffling from another direction, realizing that the noise wasn't coming from just one spot, but multiple areas under there. Then common sense hit me hard. What on earth had I expected? Was I about to fight some crackhead living beneath the boardwalk? That idea was suicide. I turned to leave, trying to remain calm, but before I could get completely out, something cold clamped onto my ankle. It was a hand, and I screamed as sharp fingernails dug into my skin. I kicked as hard as I could, and whatever was gripping my ankle let go, allowing me to scramble away with my arms and legs scraping against the sand and wood. I didn't stop running and sprinted straight back to my house. When I reached the front door, I pounded on it until my dad finally answered, and he was absolutely furious. He nearly exploded. I was thankful he didn't get physical with me. I recounted everything, the lost keys, the shoelace marker, and the people under the boardwalk. The commotion even woke my mom, whose anger quickly shifted to fear when she saw the marks on my ankle. My dad didn't waste time. He called the police, and the next morning a locksmith came to change all the house locks for a few days. Things eventually returned to normal, and I thought that was the end of it, a bizarre, messed up night I'd rather forget. But then, a few mornings later, I woke up to loud knocking at the front door, way too early for any visitors. I sat in bed waiting for my parents to handle it, but when they didn't, I decided to do it myself. I pulled on a hoodie and went downstairs, peeking through the door's peephole, but saw no one. Confused, I opened the door and looked around. There was nobody in sight. I scanned the street, there were no cars or people. Just as I was about to close the door, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye on the doormat, a shoelace, my very own shoelace from that night. Without another thought, I slammed the door shut, and that afternoon we installed a security system. For weeks afterward, my family lived in constant fear, though nothing more happened. I still shudder thinking about how some random stranger knew exactly where our beach house was. Story 2. Silent Stalker. Living in a beach town during the off-season feels almost deserted, the tourists have long gone, the storefronts are mostly boarded up, and the boardwalk, which is the town's heart in summer, appears as a mere empty shell. I enjoy it, though, because it's peaceful. That's why for the longest time I chose to go for late-night runs on the boardwalk when it was completely empty. It was my way to detox from life and all its stress. Sometimes, you just need to escape from people. There was something mesmerizing about the sound of crashing waves and the steady rhythm of my sneakers hitting the wooden planks that made me feel like I owned the world. That night was no different. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and damp wood, and the only lights were the occasional street lamp buzzing softly and casting long, lonely shadows. I had run about a mile when I suddenly got that unsettling feeling, you just know you aren't alone. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man standing in the distance, not walking or moving, just standing there on the boardwalk, facing me. I swallowed hard and turned back, trying to dismiss it as nothing more than another local on a walk, though it still felt eerie. I kept running, but a few minutes later, the sensation of being followed or watched grew even stronger. My heart pounded, not from the exertion, but from something else, and my curiosity compelled me to turn around again. This time, he was noticeably closer, still motionless and just staring at me, and an unsettling feeling churned in my stomach. I quickened my pace, pulling out the only headphone I had, while my feet pounded the wood and my breath grew rapid. Every few seconds, I heard footsteps behind me in sync with mine. I looked back again, he was even closer now, yet still standing perfectly still. I broke into a sprint, but that familiar boardwalk suddenly felt like an endless trap stretching in both directions. My car was parked at the very end near the beach entrance, and I just had to reach it. I ran faster than ever before, my lungs burned and my legs screamed, but I refused to stop. Every time I stole a glance over my shoulder, he appeared a bit nearer, standing silently and watching me. I couldn't understand how he managed to stop so suddenly each time I turned around. Soon, the boardwalk exit came into view, and I nearly wept with relief when I finally saw my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so much I could barely press the unlock button. At last, the lights flashed, and I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut behind me. I started the car and backed out of the parking spot. When I put the car in drive and swerved left to exit, I glanced ahead, and the man was standing right where my car had been. I only caught a brief glimpse of him, all I saw was that his hood was pulled up, covering much of his face. I jerked the wheel to the left and nearly spun out as I drove away. For the entire ride home, I didn't care if I ran a red light, swerved, or almost lost control, I just drove without ever looking back. When I finally got home, I secured every door and window, and I didn't sleep that night. Since then, I've had several nightmares about that experience. Each time, that faceless man appeared in different, haunting forms, chasing or watching me. I haven't gone for a winter run on the boardwalk since. Story 3. Shattered Shelter. Last summer when I was 22, I spent a weekend at the shore with a group of friends in the cheapest Airbnb we could find. On the final night of our stay, we had been out on the beach all evening around a bonfire, just hanging out, drinking, and chatting, nothing too wild. By the end of the night, most of my friends were ready to call it quits, but I wasn't tired yet, so I decided to walk off the buzz before returning to the Airbnb. At night, the boardwalk takes on an unusual tranquility, with everything empty, a new and fascinating experience for me since I hadn't spent much time at the beach before. After wandering for a while, I suddenly realized I really had to pee, which was problematic because I'm not the type to use public restrooms, a fact my friends often tease me about. I spotted one of those rundown boardwalk bathrooms, old, barely lit, and not ideal, but I didn't feel like holding it in until I got back. I pushed the door open and immediately regretted it, the place reeked of bleach mixed with whatever they used to mask the odor. I planned to make it quick, so I went to the farthest stall, but that's when I heard the stall door creak open again. I winced, annoyed at the loss of privacy, and listened as footsteps slowly began to circle the bathroom, a rather odd occurrence. It sounded as if the footsteps were coming from several directions, suggesting there was more than one person, though I wasn't completely sure. Eventually, the sound stopped near the sinks, with no movement or coughs, and even the water remained off, leaving me puzzled about what they were doing. I finished up and prepared to leave, but when I tried to open the stall door, it wouldn't budge. I jiggled the latch, but the door stayed firmly stuck. I was so angry and uncomfortable I almost wanted to punch it. Then the footsteps started again, this time closer, and I felt an unsettling heat in my chest as if someone was holding the door shut. I shoved the door with my shoulder, but still nothing moved. Adrenaline surged through me and my mind began to connect the dots. I decided I couldn't just sit there like an easy target. I charged the door with all my strength until it finally gave way, sending me stumbling out. Bursting from the stall, I saw the bathroom door swing shut as if someone had just exited. I scanned the now empty bathroom. It was clear that the person who had been circling was gone. I quickly washed my hands and headed for the exit, but when I reached for the door handle, it wouldn't turn, as if the bathroom had been locked from the outside. I froze, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? I thought maybe one of my friends was messing with me, but that didn't add up since they'd all left already and none of them would behave like that. I was utterly freaked out, so I gritted my teeth and began pounding on the door, yelling for whoever was out there to open up. There was no response. Just then I heard movement from one of the stalls behind me. I whipped my head around. Though I couldn't see anything, I was sure someone was in one of the stalls, which meant there had been at least 2 people the entire time. I didn't see any feet beneath any of the stall doors, so they must have been standing on one of the toilets, which was even more disturbing. I considered calling the police, but I knew I had to get to safety first. I was in danger. I spotted a grimy window high up near the ceiling. It wasn't large, but it was my only option. I climbed onto the sink, which I feared might break under my weight, and managed to force the window open. Halfway out, one of the stall doors burst open behind me, and I locked eyes with a man who was shockingly hairy with the palest skin I'd ever seen. He was dressed like a teenager, yet he looked about 50 years old. I didn't waste another second. I scrambled out of the window and dropped onto the boardwalk. My knee hit the ground hard, but I didn't care, I just ran. Once I was at a safe distance, I called the cops. They arrived quickly, as expected in a beach town. By the time they checked the bathroom, that man had long vanished. That section of the boardwalk was deserted, with no cameras or open shops to verify anything. I showed the officers where everything happened, and one of them pointed to scratches on the bathroom door handle, remarking that someone clearly tampered with it. They all agreed that whoever it was clearly didn't want me to leave, which wasn't comforting at all. The officers told me I was lucky to escape through the window, and that was that. I had to leave the beach the next day, so I never received any further updates on the incident, and I doubt the police investigated much. Music. I apologize if some details seem mixed up. The incident happened when I was very young, maybe 8 or 9, during one of those summers my family spent at my grandparents' beach house. That house was like the family hub, where cousins, aunts, uncles, and siblings would gather for weekends or even weeks. It wasn't fancy by any means, but it had enough bedrooms to comfortably sleep the entire family, and it was really close to the beach. I would spend entire days playing in the sand and exploring the neighborhood on my bike, and every summer there was amazing. Now, as I grow older, it all feels like an extended fever dream. I remember that summer being different. There was a huge hurricane forecast that had everyone in the beach town scrambling to prepare months in advance. I'm not sure if other beach towns did this, but ours built massive sand dunes along the shore as a makeshift barrier. I'm not sure dunes is even the right word. They were enormous, and to a kid, they looked like castle walls. I bet an aerial view of the coast during that time would have been absolutely wild. My siblings and I would spend hours climbing the dunes and tumbling down the other side, pretending we were scaling mountains or sneaking into a fortress. It was strange because, normally, when you stand on the boardwalk facing the beach, you see the ocean stretching out before you. But those dunes completely blocked the view. Walking along the boardwalk meant encountering a giant wall of sand instead of water. The beach would also close after a certain hour, so even though lifeguards stopped patrolling and people weren't supposed to be there, that never stopped us locals. The town was safe, everyone knew each other, and as long as we promised not to go into the ocean, our parents didn't mind, even though I was a bit of a troublemaker who loved pushing boundaries. That's what led me to sneak out that evening. It wasn't dark yet, the sun hadn't even started to set, but I didn't ask for permission, I just craved some alone time. I might have had a fight with one of my brothers, though I can't recall exactly, but the sliding door by the kids' bedrooms made it easy to come and go unnoticed. My older cousins practically had a playbook for sneaking around for more rebellious reasons than my solo beach walk, and I learned from them. Even today, we laugh about how easily we could sneak in and out of the house without the adults noticing. So, as quietly as possible, I stepped outside barefoot and headed toward the boardwalk, expecting to see a few locals or kids my age, even after beach hours. I was surprised to find it completely empty. No one was around at all. It felt like the entire beach was asleep. I was about to return when I noticed something alarming, a thin trail of smoke rising from beyond one of the dunes. At first, I thought it was just fog, but upon closer inspection, I realized it was smoke, like the kind from a fire. Smoke on the beach wasn't unheard of, even if it was against the rules and nearly illegal, since some tourists would light bonfires. But the emptiness that night made the smoke seem off. It looked almost like a volcano, with the smoke emanating directly from the dune. I looked around for an adult, but there was no one, only the empty boardwalk stretching in every direction. I probably should have gone home, but curiosity got the better of me, plus my parents had taught me never to turn my back on someone in need, and this situation felt that way. I climbed up the sand dune a short distance away from the smoke, and by the time I reached the top, I was completely covered in sand. I looked down the other side and saw what I expected, a bonfire, but it was completely isolated, with no chairs, coolers, or anyone around, just a fire burning in the middle of an empty beach as if abandoned. That didn't sit right with me. Even at that age, I knew leaving a fire unattended was dangerous. I slid down the dune and approached it, standing there for a moment just staring, unsure of what to do next. I began kicking sand onto the fire repeatedly until the flames finally died out. Even then, I lingered, too curious to simply walk away. I couldn't figure out why someone would light a fire and then leave it behind unless they had sinister motives. I inspected the remnants and made a series of eerie discoveries. There were children's clothes, small shoes, socks, and bits of fabric. Using a stick, I poked around and realized the fire had mostly burned through the clothes, which filled me with a sick feeling, but then I noticed something else: photos. Most were charred beyond recognition, but one still held enough detail for me to see a boy's face, likely around my age. He even looked a bit like me, as if a parent had claimed he was a distant cousin. I would have believed it. The picture scared me badly, and I felt the urge to run, dropping the stick in my haste. I was just a kid, and nothing this frightening had ever happened to me before. I was terrified. Then I heard a voice shout, "Hey," from somewhere far off. I looked up to see a bald man staggering toward me from down the beach. I couldn't make out much of his face from so far away, and he appeared to be either drunk or something worse. He yelled, "Hey kid," and began moving faster in my direction. I couldn't move. I was frozen with fear as he shouted, "Don't you go anywhere." That was the final push I needed. My mind finally caught up with my body, and I started running toward the sand wall. The sand made every step difficult, but I felt as if my life depended on it. I climbed the dune while hearing him hurl obscene shouts behind me, growing closer with every step. Just as I reached the top, I felt fingernails clawing at my ankle, but by some miracle he couldn't get a firm grip, and I vaulted over the dune, tumbling down to the bottom. I sprinted back to the boardwalk and ran all the way home, constantly glancing back to ensure he wasn't following. Once I got home, I locked every door and window immediately and bolted to my room, where I burst into tears. I wanted to tell my parents everything, but all I could think about was the fact that I had snuck out and would surely be in big trouble, so I kept silent. Looking back, no, I should have told someone, but nothing ever came of it. No news reports, no police the next day, no reports of missing children in the area. To this day, I can't make sense of it, even though it happened so long ago. What terrifies me the most is how eerily the kid in those photos resembles me. Sometimes I wish I could go back in time and warn my younger self to speak up, but that's a burden I'll have to live with.